The sirens pierced the morning air as 3 police cars raced toward Willowbrook Lake. Officer Martinez was the first to spot it, a small wooden boat house floating 30 feet from shore, bobbing gently in the current. From inside came the most ear-piercing screams he'd heard in 15 years on the force. A middle-aged woman pressed her face against the window, pounding frantically on the glass, her gray hair disheveled and her floral blouse soaked through. She was shouting something about being kidnapped, her voice cracking with hysteria as the structure drifted further into the lake. 3 weeks earlier I had finally finished restoring my grandfather's old boat house. It sat on my private dock, overlooking the peaceful waters of Willowbrook Lake. The project had taken me 6 months of weekend sanding weathered boards, replacing rotted beams, and painting it a classic navy blue with white trim. It was my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the chaos of suburban life and enjoy a quiet cup of coffee while watching the sunrise over the water. I should have known that peace wouldn't last long in Pine Ridge Estates, not with Karen Pettin prowling the neighborhood like a hawk in a pantsuit. Karen had been the HOA president for 4 years, and in that time she'd made herself the unofficial dictator of our little community. She was the type of woman who measured grass with a ruler and issued violations for Christmas decorations left up past January 2nd. Her latest crusade was my boathouse, which he claimed violated the community's aesthetic guidelines. The irony wasn't lost on me. The structure sat on my private property 20 feet beyond the HOA's jurisdiction, but that hadn't stopped Karen from filing complaint after complaint with the town council. For 2 months she'd bombarded me with certified letters, each one more threatening than the last. She'd organized neighborhood meetings, circulated petitions, and even hired a lawyer to challenge the boat house's legality. But the town council had been clear. My property extended to the W's edge, and I had every right to maintain a dock and boathouse on my own land. Karen's defeat at the final hearing had been spectacular. She'd stormed out of the council chambers, her face purple with rage, shouting something about property values and community standards. After that public humiliation, Karen had gone suspiciously quiet. No more letters, no more angry phone calls, no more impromptu visits to my front door with a clipboard full of violations. I thought maybe she'd finally accepted defeat and moved on to terrorizing some other neighbor. I was wrong, dead wrong. Last Tuesday morning I'd walked down to the boathouse with my coffee ready to enjoy another peaceful sunrise. That's when I heard the rustling inside. At first I thought it might be a raccoon or maybe some teenagers using it as a hideout, but when I pushed open the door I found Karen Pettin herself sitting on a folding chair with a thermos of tea and a stack of legal documents spread across a card table she'd somehow managed to haul inside. Karen looked up at me with the smug expression I'd ever seen, her thin lips curved into a triumphant smile. She announced that she was now occupying the boathouse as a form of peaceful protest against what she called my flagrant disregard for community standards. She'd brought a sleeping bag, a portable camping toilet, and enough canned goods to last a week. She informed me with obvious glee that removing her would constitute assault, and she had her phone ready to call 911 at the first sign of physical confrontation. I tried reasoning with her, explaining that she was trespassing on private property and that her protest had no legal basis. Karen just laughed, a sharp grating sound that made my teeth ache. She pulled out a thick folder of papers and began reading from what she claimed was a legal brief about adverse possession and squatters' rights. Most of it was nonsense. She'd clearly done her research on Google University, but she delivered it with the confidence of a Supreme Court justice. Over the next 3 days Karen fortified her position. She installed a deadbolt on the inside of the door and hung curtains over the windows. She'd arranged for food deliveries from her friend Min, who would leave bags of groceries on the dock twice a day. Karen had even set up a battery-powered radio and spent her evenings listening to talk shows about property rights and civil disobedience. Every morning I'd find new signs taped to the outside of the boathouse, hand-altered proclamations about community activism and the rights of concerned citizens. I contacted the other HOA board members hoping they'd intervene and talk some sense into their president, but they all gave me the same response: they couldn't get involved in what they called a personal dispute between neighbors. Translation: They were all terrified of Karen and didn't want to risk becoming her next target. Even my lawyer shook his head when I described the situation. He said that while Karen was clearly trespassing, removing her by force could result in assault charges, and the legal process to evict her could take months. By Friday night I'd had enough. Karen's occupation of my boat house had become the neighborhood's main entertainment. Cars would slow down as they passed my house, with entire families gawking at the woman who'd barricaded herself inside a floating shed. Karen seemed to thrive on the attention, occasionally emerging to wave at her supporters or shout slogans about property rights and community activism. She'd even given an interview to the local newspaper describing herself as a modern-day Rosa Parks fighting against aesthetic tyranny. That's when inspiration struck. I remembered something my grandfather had told me when he first built the boathouse 40 years ago. The structure wasn't permanently attached to the dock. It was designed to float freely during high water seasons, tethered only by heavy rope lines to keep it in position. The boathouse was essentially a housebo, legally speaking, which meant it could be moved at the owner's discretion. Saturday night I waited until Karen's radio went silent and the lights in the boathouse went dark. Around 2 o'clock in the morning I crept down to the dock wearing dark clothes and rubber-soled shoes. Karen was snoring loudly inside, probably exhausted from another day of righteous indignation. Working as quietly as possible, I began untying the thick marine ropes that secured the boathouse to its pilings. The current in Willowbrook Lake was gentle but persistent, fed by an underground spring that kept the water moving toward the dam on the far end. Once I'd released the final rope, the boathouse began to drift, almost immediately sliding away from the dock. With barely a whisper, I stood on the shore and watched as Karen's fortress of solitude floated slowly into the darkness, carrying its oblivious occupant toward the center of the lake. By dawn, the boathouse had drifted nearly 50 feet from shore. I was sipping my coffee on the dock, enjoying the sunrise and the blessed silence, when Karen's screams shattered the morning peace. The sounds coming from inside the floating structure weren't like anything I'd ever heard, a combination of panic, rage, and disbelief that could probably be heard 3 neighborhoods away. Karen's face appeared at the window, her eyes wide with terror as she realized her situation. She was no longer on solid ground, no longer in control, no longer the master of her own destiny. The boat house continued its lazy drift toward the center of the lake, spinning slowly in the current like a very angry music box. Karen pounded on the windows with both fists, her mouth moving frantically as she shouted threats and demands that were mostly lost in the morning breeze. Then came the phone call to 911. I could hear every word through the thin walls as Karen screamed into her cell phone, claiming she'd been kidnapped and was being held against her will on a floating prison. She demanded immediate rescue and the arrest of her captor, who she described as a dangerous vigilante with a complete disregard for human life. The dispatcher's calm questions only seemed to make Karen more hysterical, and her responses became increasingly incoherent as the boathouse drifted further from shore. Within 20 minutes, the cavalry arrived. 3 police cars, a fire truck, and an ambulance converged on my property with sirens blaring and lights flashing. Officer Martinez took charge of the scene, first checking on Karen's immediate safety before turning his attention to me. I calmly explained the situation, providing him with copies of my property deed, the boathouse's registration documents, and a detailed timeline of Karen's unlawful occupation. The rescue itself was almost anticlimactic. The fire department launched their small boat and reached the drifting boathouse within minutes. As Karen emerged looking like a drowned cat, her carefully styled hair plastered to her head and her business attire soaked with lake water. She'd apparently tried to paddle the boathouse back to shore using a canoe, or with predictably ineffective results. As the paramedics checked Karen for hypothermia, she launched into a breathless tirade about my criminal behavior and her rights as a community leader. She demanded my immediate arrest for kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and reckless endangerment. Officer Martinez listened patiently, taking notes as Karen recounted her version of events with increasingly dramatic flourishes. But when Martinez asked Karen to explain exactly why she'd been inside my boathouse in the first place, her story began to fall apart. Under questioning, she admitted to entering the structure without permission, installing her own lock, and refusing to leave despite multiple requests. The officer's expression grew more skeptical as Karen tried to justify her actions with rambling explanations about community service and moral obligations. The legal reality was crystal clear. Karen had committed criminal trespass by entering and remaining in my boathouse without permission. The structure was legally registered as a floating vessel on private water, which meant I had every right to move it as I saw fit. Officer Martinez consulted with his supervisor by radio, then returned with a citation book in hand. Karen's face went through a remarkable transformation as Martinez began writing. The righteous indignation drained away, replaced by dawning horrors. She realized the tables had turned. She was the one being charged, not me. Criminal trespass in the first degree, and lawful occupation of a dwelling, and interference with property rights, 3 misdemeanor charges that could result in significant fines and possible jail time. The aftermath moved swiftly. Word of Karen's aquatic adventure spread through Pine Ridge Estates faster than a wildfire. By Monday morning, my inbox was flooded with messages from neighbors sharing their own stories of Karen's tyrannical behavior. Mrs. Chen described how Karen had forced her to repaint her mailbox 3 times to achieve the perfect shade of regulation beige. The Johnsons recounted Karen's crusade against their children's swing set, which he claimed violated the community's noise ordinances. Most importantly, a group of residents had quietly been organizing their own rebellion against Karen's dictatorship, led by Tom Henderson, a retired attorney who lived 2 streets over. They've been documenting Karen's abuses of power and building a case for her removal from the HOA board. Karen's boathouse incident was exactly the ammunition they needed. The emergency HOA meeting was called for Thursday evening. Karen arrived dressed in her finest power suit, clearly expecting to rally support and paint herself as a victim of vigilante justice. Instead, she walked into a room full of hostile faces and a table covered with evidence of her misconduct. Tom Henderson had prepared a presentation that would have made a prosecutor proud, complete with photographs, witness statements, and a detailed timeline of Karen's increasingly erratic behavior. The vote wasn't even close, by a margin of 8-1, with only Karen voting for herself. The board removed her as president and stripped her of all HOA authority. The room erupted in applause as Tom read the final tally, while Karen sat frozen in her chair, her face cycling through expressions of shock, rage, and disbelief. For the first time in 4 years, the residents of Pine Ridge Estates had successfully revolted against their self-appointed dictator, but the real consequences were just beginning. Karen's employer, a local real estate firm where she worked as a sales agent, had seen the news coverage of her boathouse adventure. Being arrested for trespassing wasn't exactly the kind of publicity they wanted associated with their business. Within a week, Karen received a letter informing her that her services were no longer required. Effective immediately, the legal bills began piling up as Karen hired lawyer after lawyer to fight the charges and explore her options for suing me. Each attorney delivered the same disappointing news: she had no case. The criminal charges stuck, and her dreams of a massive civil settlement evaporated under the harsh light of legal reality. The final tally was devastating: $15,000 in legal fees, $3,000 in fines, and a criminal record that would follow her for years. Standing in the courtroom as the judge delivered her sentence, Karen's transformation was complete. The imperious HOA president who had terrorized an entire neighborhood was gone, replaced by a defeated woman who could barely afford her rent. As the bailiff explained the terms of her probation, Karen's face crumpled with the realization that her reign of suburban terror was finally